Welcome back, everyone. We're taking a deep dive today into why relationships, sometimes just don't work out.
It's definitely something we all wonder about, right?
Absolutely. And to get some answers, we're going to be looking at this episode. It's called Why Men Don't Always Last and Why They Sometimes Cheat.
Okay.
From a podcast, Love Unfiltered is what it's called. And just a heads up, the topic can be a little sensitive at times, but our goal here, just like the original podcast, is to really understand the complexities of relationships, without judging anybody.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach. Just trying to understand the different perspectives and where people are coming from.
Exactly. So have you ever, been in a relationship or seen one where you're kind of left scratching your head wondering, like, what went wrong?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to try to unpack some surprising insights from this Love Unfiltered episode. It might even help you, going forward.
That'd be great. I'm ready to learn.
Okay, so the podcast, it starts off by talking about what they call a cocktail of reasons why some men struggle to keep a relationship going.
Okay. Interesting. A cocktail of reasons.
Yeah, and they give 5 main ones: fear of commitment, emotional unavailability, unrealistic expectations, communication differences, and then there's the grass is greener syndrome.
Right. And I think those can apply to anyone in a relationship, not just men.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think everyone, no matter who you are, can relate to at least one of those reasons. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure. At different points in our lives, we've probably all experienced at least a little bit of each.
So let's break them down one by one, starting with that fear of commitment.
All right. Let's dive in.
So the podcast tells this funny story about this guy named Ryan who totally freaks out when his girlfriend leaves a toothbrush at his apartment.
Oh, no. A toothbrush. That's serious.
Right. He sees it as this huge symbol of commitment, and he pretty much runs for the hills. Like, it's too much.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, it sounds funny, but it also shows how scary commitment can be for some people. It's not always a choice, it's like this deep down fear.
Yeah, like almost an instinct.
Right.
So they talk about how, for some guys, commitment triggers this feeling of being trapped. Or like they're going to lose their independence and suddenly, that toothbrush is a threat.
It's like their freedom is at stake.
Yeah.
In their minds.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting how societal expectations also kind of play into this, For so long, there's been this idea that, real men don't commit.
Right, like they need to be these lone wolves or something. It's a very outdated idea.
Totally. And, this fear of commitment, it kind of goes hand in hand with the next reason: emotional unavailability.
Ah, yes. That's a big one.
The Love Unfiltered people, they use this awesome analogy. They compare emotional unavailability to, trying to run Windows 95 on a modern computer.
Okay, I like that. That's a great visual.
Right. So it's like some people, especially men, maybe, they just don't have the emotional software, so to speak, to handle a modern relationship.
Right. They're not equipped to deal with all the complexities of modern love and communication.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that comes from how society tells men to, suppress their emotions, be tough and strong all the time.
Yeah, it's like they're told they can't express their feelings, that it's not manly.
And then when they get into relationships, they don't know how to, really express themselves, honestly.
It can be tough for them to connect on a deeper level because they haven't learned how to.
All right, so moving on to the next hurdle, unrealistic expectations.
Oh, boy. Don't we all have those sometimes?
Right. Thinking about, the perfect partner, the should-bes, the what-ifs. I think we've all done it at some point.
Definitely. It's easy to get caught up in those fantasies.
Yeah, and the Love Unfiltered people, they point out some really common ones, like wanting your partner to be, your therapist, your cheerleader, and your personal chef all at the same time.
It's like wanting them to be a superhero, able to do it all.
Right. A perfect person who ticks every single box on this imaginary list, which, let's be real, is impossible.
Exactly. It sets you up for disappointment.
Yeah.
Because no one can live up to those kinds of expectations.
So it's more about finding someone who, complements you, not necessarily completes you,
Yeah. Someone who brings out the best in you.
Yeah.
And who you can grow with.
And for that, you need good communication, setting boundaries, and understanding that, compromise is key in any relationship.
Absolutely. It's all about working together as a team.
Okay, now let's talk about that communication gap between, men and women.
Ah, yes. The age-old communication struggle.
The source, they use this classic example of a woman saying, "I'm fine," when it's pretty obvious she's not fine at all.
Oh, yeah. We all know that I'm fine.
Yeah.
It usually means the opposite.
Right. It's like we're speaking different languages sometimes.
Yeah.
Even though we're using the same words.
Exactly. Women tend to be more nuanced, maybe a little more indirect in how they communicate, while men often take things more literally.
And that's where something called emotional intelligence comes in, right?
Exactly. It's being able to read between the lines, paying attention to the nonverbal cues, understanding that what's said isn't always the whole story.
It's a skill that everyone could benefit from, for sure. Okay, so finally, let's tackle the grass is greener syndrome. That feeling that maybe, just maybe, there's something better out there.
Oh, I think we've all felt that at some point.
Right. That little voice in your head, like, what if, whether you're single or even in a relationship?
And I'm curious, what does the source say about why we feel that way?
They talk about how our brains are hardwired to want new things. There's this like surge of dopamine, which is the feel-good hormone, right? When we experience something new and exciting.
It's like we're chasing that high.
And in relationships, that can make what's familiar seem, I don't know, kind of boring.
Yeah, you lose that initial spark, that excitement of the unknown. And it can be hard to appreciate the comfortable love you have.
Right, and then you throw in social media.
Oh, don't even get me started on social media.
Right, we're constantly seeing these seemingly perfect relationships, and it can make our own feel, I don't know, kind of less than.
It's like comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel.
Exactly. And the podcast, they actually make a good point that this grass is greener feeling, it can actually be a chance to grow.
Really? How so?
Well, it can be a sign that maybe something's missing in your current relationship, like a chance to figure out what needs aren't being met or where you've maybe gotten complacent.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, instead of seeing it as a reason to, end things, you can use it as motivation to actually work on the relationship.
To reignite that spark.
Exactly. It's about focusing on what you already have and, making that connection even stronger.
Right. Nurturing what you have instead of always looking for something else.
Okay, so we've talked about those 5 challenges that can, lead to relationships ending, but the source doesn't stop there. They also talk about infidelity.
Okay. That's a whole other level of complexity.
It is, but just like with the other stuff we've talked about, we're approaching it with, curiosity and a desire to understand why people do the things they do.
To understand the motivation behind it all.
Exactly. Are you ready to explore this next layer?
Absolutely. The more we understand, the better we can navigate these tricky waters.
All right, so we're getting into the territory of infidelity now, and I know this can be like a really sensitive topic.
Yeah, for sure.
But like the podcast, we're not here to, judge anyone or say what's right or wrong. We really just want to try to understand why these things happen.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the motivations, not condoning the behavior.
Right, exactly.
So
what are some of the reasons the podcast gives for why some men cheat?
Well, they start with one of the most, basic ones. Opportunity and temptation.
Okay, like the wrong place at the wrong time kind of thing.
Yeah. They use this example of a guy who's at a party, maybe had a few drinks, and suddenly that coworker he sees every day starts to look a lot more appealing.
Ah, I see. So like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, except sometimes Vegas comes to you.
Exactly. Things can get out of hand pretty quickly, especially with alcohol involved.
Yeah, you're not thinking as clearly.
Right. Your inhibitions are lowered, your judgment's clouded, and you might make decisions you wouldn't normally make.
So is it just like a lack of self-control then?
It can be a part of it, but I think it's also important to remember that everyone is susceptible to temptation. It's part of being human,
Yeah.
We're drawn to new and exciting things. The key is having self-awareness and those boundaries in place to handle those situations responsibly.
So that's like the being in the wrong place at the wrong time kind of scenario. But what about when it's when infidelity stems from deeper issues within the relationship itself?
Right. So the podcast goes on to talk about emotional neglect. And they tell a story about this guy, Mike, who cheats on his girlfriend because he feels ignored and unappreciated in the relationship.
He's not getting what he needs.
Exactly. He's looking for attention, validation, and he's just not finding it with his partner, so he looks for it elsewhere.
It's like he's trying to fill that void somehow.
Yeah, and this really highlights that, men have emotional needs too.
Yeah.
It's not just a woman thing.
Right.
They may not always express those needs in the same way, but they're just as important.
It's a good reminder that we need to pay attention to our partners and make sure they feel, seen and heard, make sure they know we appreciate them.
Definitely. Because if those needs aren't met within the relationship, they might start looking for them outside of it.
Okay, this next one is, I guess you could say it's pretty straightforward, boredom.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The podcast says that sometimes people cheat simply because, I don't know, things have become routine, the spark has kind of fizzled out.
It happens, especially in long-term relationships.
Yeah, life gets in the way, you get busy, and then all of a sudden, you're just going through the motions with your partner.
It's what they call in the podcast the Netflix and chill rut.
Yeah.
And while, comfy nights in can be great, it's important to make sure you're still putting in the effort to keep things exciting in the relationship.
So, like, how do you avoid that rut?
The podcast suggests, doing new things together, maybe plan some date nights or activities that bring back that sense of connection and fun. You got to remember that a relationship needs to be nurtured. You can't just let it stagnate.
Okay. Now, for one that might surprise some people, insecurity.
Insecurity. Interesting.
Yeah. The podcast explains that sometimes men cheat, not because they're, confident players or anything, but because they're actually really insecure.
That seems counterintuitive.
It does. But it makes sense when you think about it. Cheating, for some guys, it's a way to, get validation from outside sources,
Yeah?
to boost their ego and prove that they're still desirable.
It's like they're looking for reassurance, but in all the wrong places.
Exactly. And it often goes back to those societal pressures we talked about earlier about what it means to be a man, successful, confident, all that. And when they don't feel that way inside, they might look for it in these unhealthy ways.
So it's not about the other person, really. It's about them trying to deal with their own internal struggles.
Right. And then finally, there's the role of consequences, or actually the lack of consequences.
Okay, I'm listening.
They say that some men cheat because, well, they think they can get away with it. There's no accountability, so there's no deterrent.
Exactly. They compare it to, a child testing limits, If there are no consequences for bad behavior, they'll just keep pushing it further.
And in a relationship, that means having clear expectations, setting boundaries, and understanding what happens if those boundaries are crossed.
It's about creating a foundation of, respect and accountability.
Exactly. Making sure that both partners feel safe and secure in the relationship, knowing that their needs and boundaries are valued and respected. Okay, so we've talked about all these reasons why relationships can, go wrong. But I'm curious, does the podcast give any advice on how to actually, spot the warning signs before things get too bad?
Yeah, that would be super helpful, right?
Yeah.
How can we actually use this information in our own lives?
Exactly. What do they say about, seeing those red flags early on?
Well, they talk about noticing sudden changes in behavior.
Okay, like what?
Like if your partner, I don't know, becomes more withdrawn, more distant than usual, or maybe they're working late all the time and they don't seem as interested in, spending time together.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And communication can change too. Like maybe they're not as open and talkative as they used to be.
Those are definitely things to pay attention to, but I guess it's important to, not jump to conclusions based on just one or two things.
Oh, absolutely. They really stress that context is everything.
Right.
Maybe your partner is just stressed out from work or dealing with something personal,
Yeah.
It's important to actually talk to them before assuming the worst.
So it's more about noticing a pattern of behavior, not just reacting to one isolated thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I like that the podcast doesn't just point out all the problems,
Right.
They actually give some pretty good advice for both men and women on how to actually strengthen their relationships.
So what do they recommend?
Well, for the guys, they really emphasize learning to communicate better.
Okay.
Both, verbally and emotionally, being able to actually say what they need and how they feel, and being open to listening to their partner without getting defensive.
Yeah, that's huge. But I can imagine that's really hard for some men, especially with all those, societal expectations we talked about.
Totally. And along with that, they talk about, showing appreciation for your partner.
Yeah.
Like actually acknowledging the things they do and letting them know you're grateful for them.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's those little things that make the biggest difference. Just letting your partner know that you see them and you appreciate them. Exactly. And for the women, they say, encourage open communication, create a safe space for your partner to express themselves.
Without feeling judged, yeah.
Right. And it's about being open to hearing their feelings, even if, they're not always expressed perfectly.
It's about meeting them where they are.
Yeah.
Emotionally.
And they also say, address issues early on before they become big problems. Be assertive about your needs and don't let resentment build up.
That can be hard though, right? It's easier to just avoid conflict sometimes.
It is. But they make a good point that avoiding those little conflicts can actually lead to, bigger blow-ups later on.
Yeah, it's like sweeping things under the rug.
Yeah.
It might seem okay at first, but eventually all that dust is going to come out.
Exactly. And finally, for the women, they emphasize, taking care of yourself. Make sure you're taking care of your own physical, emotional, mental well-being.
It's that whole put on your own oxygen mask first kind of thing.
Right. You can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
You have to take care of yourself so you can be the best partner you can be. Wow, we really covered a lot in this deep dive.
We did.
We talked about why relationships fail, the whole thing about infidelity, and even some tips on, how to actually build stronger relationships.
It's been really insightful looking at all the different facets of relationships.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways is that relationships are work.
Yeah, definitely not always easy.
They take effort and communication and a willingness to, grow and change both as individuals and together.
And even then, sometimes things just don't work out.
Right. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you failed or anything. It just means that, it wasn't the right fit. And every relationship, whether it lasts or not, teaches you something valuable about yourself.
About what you want, what you need, and what you don't want.
Exactly. So as we wrap things up, I'm left wondering, how do we actually keep the spark alive in long-term relationships?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. How do we avoid that Netflix and chill rut that the podcast talked about? It's something for all of us to think about. So what are some maybe unconventional ways to keep that flame burning bright? Have you found anything that works for you? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those relationships strong.